July 7, 1944. The final desperate act of an empire's spiritual dogma clashed head-on with the devastating calculus of industrial warfare. It was the night a scream became a statistic, the moment courage was rendered irrelevant by computation, and the largest Banzai charge of the Pacific War was utterly erased. On July 7, 1944, at 4:45 a.m., on the Tanapag Plain of northern Saipan, over 4,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians began moving forward, bayonets fixed, officers with raised swords, and behind them, the walking wounded, some carried on stretchers. What they didn't know as they advanced was that they were walking into the most sophisticated killing system ever deployed in combat, a system about to write the mathematics of modern war in a language the Imperial Japanese Army had refused to learn. Marine Artillery Observer Corporal James Whelan watched this impossible sight through his field glasses, thousands of men forming for a human wave attack against the era of automatic weapons and coordinated artillery. He quickly recorded the coordinates. Grid 164/223, estimated 4,000 plus approaching. Request all available batteries. This is not a probe. In response, over 150 American artillery tubes, including 105mm howitzers, 155mm long toms, 81mm mortars, and naval guns from 6 battleships and 8 cruisers offshore, swung toward the target grid. This firepower was organized by a revolutionary American system that could put more explosive power on a single map grid in 60 seconds than entire armies possessed in World War I. The Japanese doctrine of gyokusai, or shattering like a jewel, had evolved from effective shock tactics in China to a fatal strategic delusion against an enemy that had industrialized warfare beyond Japanese comprehension. The first stark warnings came at Guadalcanal in 1942, where pre-registered American artillery had killed over 800 Japanese soldiers in a single night during the Ichiki Detachment's charge. Survivors reported something unprecedented, shells arriving simultaneously from multiple directions, creating a wall of steel. By the Battle of Tarawa in November 1943, the Americans had perfected their fire control, able to mass fires from multiple battalions in under 2 minutes using improved radio communications and standardized procedures. The Japanese charges that relied on psychological impact were now being systematically destroyed by mathematical precision. The disparity was more than technological. It was a chasm between industrial might and warrior mythology. While Japanese artillery still relied on direct observation and individual battery fire, with communication relying on runners and signal flags, the Americans had created an integrated system that was a marvel of applied mathematics. The American Fire Direction Center, or FDC, perfected by 1944, used graphical firing tables, slide rules, and plotting boards to calculate solutions that accounted for air temperature, wind speed, barrel wear, and even the rotation of the Earth. A trained FDC crew could compute a fire mission for multiple batteries in under 60 seconds. Forward observers were connected by radio and wire to the FDC, and once they called for fire, the system ensured rounds were in the air from multiple batteries, all timed to impact simultaneously within 90 seconds. A Japanese battery might take 15 minutes to engage the same target. By July 6, 1944, the situation for Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saitō's forces on Saipan was hopeless, compressed into a tiny pocket with fewer than 5,000 combat-effective soldiers remaining out of an original 32,000. Facing encirclement, Saitō issued his final order, stating, "Whether we attack or whether we stay where we are, there is only death. However, in death, there is life." The Japanese spent the day preparing for gyokusai. Every able-bodied person, including the walking wounded and Japanese civilians, were organized into assault units, with those too wounded to walk given grenades and told to wait for American troops to pass before detonating themselves. The Americans anticipated the attack, noting unusual movement and a strange silence from Japanese artillery, suggesting they were saving ammunition for a final, desperate barrage. Lieutenant Colonel Justice Chambers, commanding the 3rd Battalion, 25th Marines, carefully positioned his men and ensured every FO had backup communications and that every battery on the island was ready. They all knew that night would be different. At exactly 4:45 a.m., the charge began, with approximately 4,000 Japanese soldiers and armed civilians moving toward a 500-yard gap between the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 105th Infantry Regiment. As they advanced, battle cries of "Banzai, Banzai, Banzai" echoed, chilling even veteran Marines. Corporal Whelan, hidden in his observation post, radioed in, "Fire mission, grid 164/223, enemy infantry in the open, estimated regiment strength moving south, request immediate suppression." The FDC's response was immediate. "Roger, grid 164/223, time on target, all available batteries, splash in 90 seconds. What followed was the pinnacle of coordinated fires, a time-on-target mission. This technique, unique to the Americans at the time, required batteries farther away to fire first and those closer to fire later, ensuring dozens of shells from multiple batteries and naval gunfire would materialize out of the sky simultaneously, giving no warning. At 4:47 a.m., the sky above the advancing Japanese erupted. The effect on the densely packed formation was catastrophic. The 105th Infantry's supporting artillery alone fired over 2,600 rounds in the first hour. Artillery crews, having spent days perfecting their fuse-cutting techniques, ensured the manually set time fuses proved devastatingly effective, creating deadly airbursts over the charging ranks. Despite the slaughter, the Japanese kept coming, the essence of the Banzai charge. The survivors picked their way through the bodies of their comrades, still screaming. This is where American artillery superiority was fully realized, the ability to maintain continuous adjusted fire as the enemy moved. Corporal Whelan continued calling in corrections. Drop 200, left 100. Enemy infantry continuing advance, request repeat. The FDCs employed ladder fire, a system developed specifically for Banzai charges, walking the barrage backward and then forward through the enemy ranks like a giant scythe cutting wheat. By 5:30 a.m., the main charge had advanced only 400 yards at a devastating cost, with bodies carpeting the valley floor. As the Japanese closed the distance, the fighting transitioned to the close-quarters defense of the 105th Infantry Regiment, which would ultimately suffer nearly 80% casualties, 406 killed and 512 wounded. The American integration of direct and indirect fire proved its worth. Battalion and company mortars engaged targets too close for artillery. At one point, approximately 600 Japanese soldiers penetrated the American line and overran the artillery positions of the 3rd Battalion, 10th Marines. The artillery crews fought as infantry, removing firing locks from their howitzers, and some batteries depressed their gun barrels to fire point-blank into the charging Japanese. The Navy also added its immense weight, with the battleship USS Tennessee and the cruiser USS Louisville firing star shells for illumination and high-explosive rounds. Fire control parties ashore could communicate directly with the naval ships. When Japanese reserves were spotted, the call went out for naval gunfire. The Tennessee fired 293 rounds of 14-inch ammunition, and the Louisville contributed 322 rounds of 8-inch shells. By 7:30 a.m., the Banzai charge had completely degenerated, shattered by coordinated firepower. The American artillery shifted to harassing and interdiction fire, denying the enemy any safe ground for reorganization. The most tragic phase began around 9 a.m., with the final desperate actions of the wounded. Eyewitness accounts report men hopping forward on crutches holding grenades, and severely wounded soldiers crawling toward American lines. The chaos of the charge produced 3 posthumous Medal of Honor recipients whose actions are thoroughly documented. Lieutenant Colonel William J. O'Brien, commanding the 1st Battalion, 105th Infantry, refused evacuation despite being wounded and fought with a Jeep-mounted .50 caliber machine gun and 2 pistols until he was killed, his body found surrounded by at least 30 dead Japanese soldiers. Private Thomas A. Baker destroyed a Japanese strongpoint with a bazooka, killed at least 24 enemy soldiers, and, severely wounded, refused evacuation, choosing to die fighting, propped against a tree with 8 dead Japanese around him. Captain Benjamin L. Salomon, the battalion surgeon, killed 4 Japanese with his rifle when they entered his aid station and then covered the evacuation of the wounded with a machine gun. His body was found slumped over the weapon with 98 dead Japanese soldiers in front of his position. As full daylight came to Saipan at 10 a.m., the full extent of the slaughter became visible. Official body count teams would document 4,311 Japanese dead from the charge. American casualties totaled approximately 1,000 killed and wounded, with the 105th Infantry Regiment essentially destroyed as a fighting unit. The stark mathematics of the battle showed the American artillery fired approximately 12,000 rounds, coordinated from 18 separate artillery battalions plus naval gunfire. The system had functioned exactly as designed. As Lieutenant Colonel Lewis Walt observed, the enemy attacked with great courage but without modern tactical sense. Our fire support system functioned exactly as designed. Major Edward McCarthy described the aftermath as looking like a cattle stampede from a Western movie, except the Japanese just kept on coming. The psychological impact on the American troops was profound, shaken not by fear, as the Japanese never truly had a chance, but by the sheer scale of the systematic killing. The American response, overwhelming firepower, reflected a philosophy of war as a problem to be solved through technology and organization, while the Japanese approached it as a test of spiritual strength. When these philosophies collided, technology always won. The American system, which had transformed artillery from an art to a science, incorporated multiple technological innovations. SCR 300 and SCR 610 FM radios for clear communication, accurate survey equipment to tie battery positions into a common grid, hourly meteorological updates, and fire control instruments like the M7 graphical firing table and M10 plotting board. The strategic implications of the disaster were immediate. The news of over 4,000 soldiers dying in a single charge with minimal American casualties contributed to the fall of Prime Minister Hideki Tojo's government on July 18, 1944. The fall of Saipan brought B-29 bombers within range of Tokyo. Despite the obvious futility demonstrated at Saipan, Japanese forces would launch more Banzai charges on other islands, each ending in similar slaughter. 9 months later at Okinawa, the kill ratio reached nearly 15-1, demonstrating the absolute dominance of coordinated firepower over human wave attacks. The artillery techniques perfected on Saipan would influence military doctrine for decades, with the FDC concept, TOT missions, and integrated forward observers becoming standard in all modern armies. 5 years later in Korea, American forces used identical techniques to destroy Chinese human wave attacks. Decades after the battle, veterans reflected on the experience. As one survivor recalled, "You have to understand, we didn't want to kill them all, but they kept coming, wave after wave. Our artillery just cut them down. It was horrible, but what choice did we have?" The destruction of the Banzai charge on Saipan was the definitive end of an era in warfare. The romance of the charge, infantry with bayonets, died on the Tanapag Plain under American artillery fire. Victory would go not to the bravest, but to those with the best systems: fire control systems, communication systems, and logistical systems. The Japanese commanders, blinded by ideology and tradition, sent their men to die in a manner that achieved nothing except to demonstrate the obsolescence of their tactical doctrine. Captain Sake Oba, who survived the charge and led a guerrilla resistance for 16 months, would later reflect, "We learned that night that courage without technology is meaningless in modern war. The Americans didn't defeat our spirit, they simply made it irrelevant." In the Valley of Death on Saipan, courage met coordination, spirit met system, and tradition met technology, and technology won.